And the first successful example we have of an insurgency turning into a revolution that had made widespread use of social tools happened 56 days ago. So this is very early days, and this was Ben Ali leaving Tunisia, which is when I date the real. That's when it was safe to call the events in Tunisia a revolution rather than just an insurgency. So it is still very early days at looking at the real effects of this, and even those of us who have been talking about the political effects of this stuff for a long time, we can now, seeing the events on the ground, talk about some of the stuff we got right, but also some of the stuff we got wrong. So I want to sketch out first an existence proof, essentially a set of reasons why we would think media, full stop, could affect political affairs. Then turn to the events in the Middle East and North Africa. And finally, I want to end with an observation about what one could do about that. Not just trying to understand social media, but actually trying to adopt it or use it in ways that are good for democracy worldwide. So we'll start with the beginning part of the argument that media can be revolutionary, full stop. And I'll tell a story from the early history of the printing press. This is a page, from William Tyndale's first English translation of the Bible to be printed. And this, of course, was blasphemy. The Catholic Church was outraged that non-Latin Bibles were being produced. And the Catholic Church's hold in England was such that Tyndale couldn't actually print it in England. He had to go to the Low Countries to get it printed. So in the late 1520s, which is when the book is coming off the printing press, Bishop of London convinced a wealthy merchant in Antwerp named Augustine Packington to go to Tyndale and to buy up every copy of the first printed English language Bible. And what he was going to do with those copies was destroy them so that they wouldn't exist anymore. Because the Bishop of London had not completely 100% understood the economics of print. And so he sent Augustine Packington to deliver a 100% sales guarantee for the first print run, at which point Tyndale turned around and created a second printing that was not only larger, but in which he corrected the errors that had been in the first print run. Right? And what I think we can see from this kind of story is that abundant media can escape the hold of organizations that had significant control of scarce media. The Catholic Church, which has famously had a banned works list for centuries, didn't start that list until after the printing press. It wasn't the existence of those books that frightened them. It was the potential abundance of those books that frightened them. The other thing I think we can see from the story, and this is just one skirmish, obviously, in the Protestant Reformation, the other thing I think we can see from that story is that even a powerful organization armed with the tools of both censorship and propaganda actually can't do as well in cases where it's facing abundant media as when it controls scarce media, which is to say the equilibrium state, even given that the Catholic Church had counter moves available to it, the equilibrium state shifted towards freedom of expression. The response to examples like this, the response on the part of people who are skeptical about the internet's effect on politics, is to say, well, yes, that's all fine for the printing press. The printing press has always been a political medium. But the internet is not an inherently political medium. The internet's principal function is distributing videos of kittens on treadmills. And that's not the same as printing translations of the Bible. But that observation isn't true. And I don't mean just that it's not true about the internet as a political medium. I mean it's not even true of the printing press. From the earliest days of commercial publishing, it did not take very long before the first erotic novels began circulating. Right? Once the Italians set themselves up in Venice in the business of charging money for books, it did not take long for someone to say, hey, you know what I bet people would pay for? It took another 150 years for anybody to even think of the scientific journal. So printing press is the kind of thing we get because erotic novel is the kind of thing we get because we're the kind of people we are, and the printing press is the kind of medium it is. Just as videos of kittens on a treadmill are the kinds of things we get when we have a medium that's like the internet and when we're like we are. But it is also possible in that same medium to press those tools into service for higher order goals. So even the history of print should make us skeptical of the idea that there are media that are inherently political or apolitical, or even that there are people who are inherently political or apolitical. Normal people don't like talking about politics. It's boring, and in authoritarian countries, it's boring and dangerous. And so most of the time they won't talk about politics. But just because they're not using the internet to talk about politics in their spare time doesn't mean they won't turn out in Tahrir Square when the serious business starts. So the thought, I think, that comes to us from the history of the printing press is that the press did not cause the Protestant Reformation. The printing press did not cause the Catholic Church to lose its millennium-long pan-European hold on economic, political, and social life. But the Protestant Reformation would not have been possible without the printing press. And so you can think of these tools in the form of leverage rather than of force. They give people who want to get things done the ability to get more things done at larger scale. So, to the internet and to digital media generally, what is it about the media we're living with today that would merit any assessment that they're revolutionary? And I'll do this with a diagram. This is a picture of the media landscape. I grew up in the media landscape of the 20th century, in which to be a media company was to have a device, whether it was a printing press or a broadcast tower, that could make multiple copies of the same thing and distribute it to the edges of the network. That's what the media did in the 20th century. Television, radio, magazines, books, movies, music, it all had this. Now, one of the early things the media industry noticed about the internet is that it allowed for a pull version of this as well. You didn't just have to push content out, that the internet was a massive positive supply-side shock to the cost and accessibility of information. And that's true. It certainly is that, as we've seen with the rise of search engines and large-scale databases. But in the political realm, that's not really what's important. Right? The belief that access to information is somehow the most important element of political use of the internet is in a way a self-flattering notion that we in the West somehow have the source code to democracy, and if only we could make it available, other people could download it and compile it. But that's not really where the freakouts are. Because the second function is this. It allows amateurs access to the public sphere. It allows citizens who are not professional media makers or distributors, nevertheless to have expressive content, whether it's text or images. And they can reach a group of people larger than you could assemble easily around a kitchen table. And those people can do it as well. The people who receive it can do it as well. And they can talk back to each other. So the third big change portended by the internet is the ability for ridiculously easy group forming, to use said Paquet's word. And I think in the political realm, we have systematically overestimated the value of access to information and systematically underestimated the value of access to each other in assessing the effects of these tools. Access to conversation matters more politically than access to information. So if I was going to order the effects of the internet and of mobile phones on politics, I wouldn't put access to information first. I would put amateur access to the public sphere first. The effect there is to be able to allow people to synchronize their political views. Governments aren't afraid of informed individuals. They are afraid of synchronized groups. And the first thing the network does is it allows groups of people to synchronize their views without having to go through professional or centralized distribution. The second effect is to allow those groups to then coordinate action. The brilliant move in Egypt to take National Police Day, January 25th, and use it as a kind of a sick joke, given how corrupt the police were in Egypt, and to make that a day of protest, that required a significant amount of advanced coordination. And you can imagine going to a newspaper in Cairo and trying to place that ad. But if you have Facebook, if you have SMS, if you have these tools, you don't have to do that anymore. And then the third effect is about information, but it's not about whether or not the people in Cairo can get information in. It's about whether they can get information out. The documentation of the events becomes the thing that the government and the people fight over. The ability of people to use their phones as still cameras, as video cameras, sometimes as audio devices, to get the material out of the country. So those three effects, synchronize, coordinate, and document, are the political substrate of a lot of what we've seen in this environment. So to the actual events starting last year. So last December 17th, a man named Mohammed Bouaziz, who was an educated but unemployed young citizen of Tunisia, had taken to selling fruit in an analogy with the Great Depression, as happened here. And the police confiscated his fruit stand. It's not clear why. The stated rationale was they didn't have a fruit-selling license, but the suspicion is that they were shaking him down and he wasn't paying out. In any case, they took his only source of livelihood, which was his fruit stand. And he went, and his last publicly recorded, actually the second to last publicly recorded act, was to leave an apology on his mother's Facebook page for what he was about to do. And then he went out in the Sidi Bouzid neighborhood, and he doused himself with gasoline, and he set himself on fire. And the day after, December 18th, was the beginning of this phase of insurgency in the Middle East and North Africa. It started as a small protest in Sidi Bouzid and grew. This is the normal pattern: small protest, large protest, military betrayal. Culminating, as I said, on January 14th when Ben Ali left. And this has plainly been a synchronizing event, because observing it happen in Tunisia has kicked off a second successful revolution in Egypt, a full-on civil war going on right now in Libya, and several small-scale insurgencies throughout the region. So, what effect has media had on those events? Let me tell a story that I think will operate by analogy. About 6 weeks ago, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, then the undisputed leader of Libya, banned soccer. Now, Libya is a football-mad country. It's a soccer-mad country. And he banned soccer outright throughout the country. So what was it about the game of soccer that terrified Gaddafi? And the answer, of course, is nothing. He wasn't afraid of the soccer. He was afraid of the stadium. Because the idea that there would be a place where people could get together and synchronize their views and coordinate their actions was implicitly a threat. And if you can understand why Gaddafi would be afraid of a soccer stadium, you can understand why he would be afraid of Facebook. And so we see these images coming out of Tunisia, coming out of Egypt, out of Libya, out of Yemen, out of Bahrain, out of Saudi Arabia. And they even use the language of these tools, even when the protests are out in the street. They adopt the language of these tools. And as Tom Sleeve has pointed out, there is an interesting and important analogy here with 1968, with the uprisings of 1968. And this is something that I completely missed. And when Slee wrote about it, it was a huge light bulb. These tools are not just utilitarian means of getting people lowering the threshold to public action. They also represent a cultural divide between the youth and the elders in these societies in the same way that rock and roll music did in the 1960s. Some rock and roll music carried explicitly political messages, but all rock and roll carried an explicitly social message, which is our generation is different. And one of the things these tools did, in addition to the utilitarian stuff that I've been talking about, synchronize, coordinate, document, is that it provides a narrative for that generation to demand change. And this is the exciting stuff. Right? This is the stirring stuff. This, of course, is the moment when Western media tunes in. However, and this is where I think I have gotten it most wrong in my previous writings about politics, I now think this isn't the most important thing. I think this is the end stage of a long process, rather than a replacement for a long process. Because where does this come from? One of the most striking images to come out of Egypt. A protester kissing a cop. And that happened over and over. I'm sorry, not a cop, a member of the military. And that happened over and over again. And that kind of behavior, that kind of disciplined nonviolence, doesn't just come from spontaneous turnout, doesn't come from rapid coordination synchronization. So where does that come from? And the answer, it turned out, is it comes from here. Right? Something called the Kefaya movement in Egypt, which launched in 2004. Kefaya is Arabic for enough. And the Kefaya movement started as a political blogging movement whose goal was to coordinate the anti-Mubarak forces. Secular, Islamist, urban, rural, labor, intelligentsia, didn't matter where these groups came from, because what the Kefaya movement said was, we all have one thing we can agree on, and that is Mubarak out. And the Kefaya movement had been operating since 2004. The discipline to conduct a nonviolent resistance movement in Egypt, culminating obviously in the events in Tahrir Square, came from here. It came from the April 6, 2008 movement, which was a labor strike. And again, an attempt to have civic action that didn't involve physical violence, but did involve physical demonstration. It came from here, the Civil Disobedience Project. All of these things started years before the events in Tahrir Square. They were built up over a long period of time. They were built out of slow, organized attempt to get people to trust each other from across different sectors of society in order to concentrate on their goal, which was enough Mubarak. And one of the things I think we're seeing happen now is what happens when this kind of social capital isn't there, when people haven't played this long game in the political environment before people turn out in the streets. So, about 4 weeks ago, the government of Sudan, seeing which way the wind was blowing, created its own Facebook page in which it announced there was going to be a protest against the government of Sudan. And then it just went down to the square and arrested everybody who showed up. And the reason that worked is that nobody knew anybody else. They thought Facebook itself was trustworthy, rather than being a platform where you could communicate with people you trusted through other means. And because there hadn't been a long densifying of the social network of people who wanted to change, the ability to get a handful of risk-taking individuals to turn out worked on behalf of the Sudanese. So these tools are not obviously magic democracy does, but they're not even rapid tools. They are simply tools you can use if you're playing both a long game and then pushing to insurgents. And we see throughout the region, Middle East, North Africa, we see examples of this kind of patient building up of social capital. And that, I think, is one of the things to concentrate. There is, in the West, and particularly in America, a tendency to ask, is the country democratic, yes or no? Right? If the answer is no, then political action has been a failure. If the answer is yes, then political action has been a success. And we know what democracy looks like. It looks like regularly scheduled, free and fair elections with periodic changes. But once you leave the frame of democratization, yes or no, you actually see that what the struggle is over is more responsive government. And democracy is a good way to get more responsive government, but it's very often the end state rather than the only event that counts. And when you start looking at the use of these tools for events that push the government to be more responsive rather than just to democratize, you see the pattern everywhere. In the last decade, in Iran, the most successful use of the internet to affect political change was not, in fact, the Green Wave, which rose up in June of '09 and was finally crushed by early February '10 through military action. It was something called the Million Signature Campaign, conducted by women who wanted to pressure the Iranian parliament not to change the laws to make polygamy easier on men and harder on women. And everywhere we look, feminism correlates strongly with successful attempts to push the government to be more responsive. And in this case, it wasn't about Iran democracy, yes or no, but rather an attempt to alter the effect. So this is, I think, when we're thinking about the political use of these tools, this is the frame I think we should be adopting. Because when we start to look at individual events like the Million Signature event, we can say, did this succeed or fail at making the government more responsive? And you start to see it as incremental change rather than either the insurgents turned out and won or everybody stayed home and did nothing. And with that frame, we are starting to see good research on very large data sets. So this is Jacob Groshek's analysis of an index crosstab between the degree of political freedom on the y-axis and the degree of internet penetration on the x-axis. And he's drawn the overlap. You can see there is a strong correlation. It's not total, but there is a strong